Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So I thought I would do a video today about why Oliver went to the Nicu and basically what happened once he got there, because the last I left you guys with my videos on my channel was that we were in the maternity unit and Oliver had just started feeding again, and they tried to give him a bottle but he couldn't take a lot of it because he was getting quite congested in the nose and he was still on a nasal gastric tube. So that was on the Sunday and he was 4 days old at that point. Basically what happened is we waited there all day and pediatrics didn't actually come around until about 4 or 5 o'clock that afternoon, and that day things changed quite a lot. So overnight Oliver had been feeding again for a couple minutes at a time. We now know that he is a quick feeder. But basically what happened is they decided to up his amount in his nasal gastric tube from 38 ml to 50 ml every 3 hours or 4 hours. I think it was 4 hours. Anyway, it was 4 hours. So they upped it to 50 ml, and the problem that caused that morning is that he was extremely tired and sleepy because he was full, and because they kept feeding him more and more, he then didn't actually need any from me, because obviously babies don't really need much more than 50 ml in that time. At only 4 days old, that is actually quite a lot for their stomach. So anyway, he was actually somewhat being overfed in a way, if that makes sense, because he had no reason to wake up, he had no reason to need me at all. And so for that entire day, he did not feed off me at all. He fed from the nasal gastric tube and that was it. So at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon when pediatrics came in, they decided that he wasn't feeding and he needed to go across to the special care unit in the Nicu. The problem with that was that maternity didn't want me to stay anymore because it was 4 days since my C-section and they don't usually keep you any longer than that. So they decided to discharge me. The issue that happened because of this is that there was not a room available in special care for me to sleep in. My old hospital had about 3 or 4 rooms that you could sleep in when your baby was in there if they were close to going home. But this hospital only had 1 room, which was called a family room, and that was available at the time. So I expected that I would be allowed to sleep in the bed, or not the bed, the chair next to his bed in the special care unit, because that is what I was told I was always allowed to do in my old hospital with my son. And they decided that once they had discharged me already, and they said that I could do that, they discharged me, sent me across there to the special care unit, and when I got there the nurses told me that no, I am not allowed to stay overnight in there, that I needed to go in at 9 o'clock in the morning and leave at 9 p.m. at night, and basically only feed him during the day, and overnight they would do tube feeds, which basically meant I could only be there for a couple more hours and then they would have to tube feed him overnight. So there was no way that I would have been able to get him discharged the next day, because he wouldn't have been breastfeeding for 24 hours, which they need you to have 24 hours of breastfeeding to be able to send you home. So they argued with me over that, because I basically said that that was setting me up to fail and there was no way I could possibly get him off the nasal gastric tube if they were doing 12 hours a night or more of nasal gastric tube, and I was only allowed to do it during the day. That was going to confuse him and it wasn't really giving us the best shot. So I also didn't really feel comfortable leaving him there on his own, because the way that their special care unit is set up, everything is open. All the babies are just in this one big open room, and the midwives can be all the way on the other side of this room and not even hear if your baby is choking. And for those of you who don't know, Oliver does actually have silent reflux. He can randomly choke just from laying down in his sleep, and we actually didn't get that diagnosed until the next night, but it did make me really nervous leaving him there for anything, like even just to go to the toilet, which was outside of that unit. So anyway, they decided to go and talk to the other coordinators and got it approved for me to sleep in the chair next to his bed. because like I was obviously really determined to get him home, and the NICU unit was actually 24-hour access, so parents were allowed to come and go within the 24 hours, but obviously no one had ever slept in a chair there before, or they weren't used to that. I don't know. I don't know many mothers that would just go home for a night and kind of leave them there voluntarily. It's definitely not the nicest thing. I did have to do that for one night with Hunter, and I definitely wish I had just stayed in the bed next to him. I was in a lot more pain with him though than what I was with Oliver, but I was really determined to get him out of the hospital. You guys would have seen that I asked on the very first day to get a lactation consultant in, and at this point I still hadn't seen one, and Oliver's feeding was getting worse and worse, which was just absolutely heartbreaking, considering I know now that the issues that were caused could have been resolved like so quickly within the first like 48 hours if I'd had a lactation consultant in there. So I basically had to separate my hospital bag into one really small bag of what I could have literally right next to me to have for, I had no idea how many days we were going to be there, but I basically just needed a change of clothes, a couple of things of food, and a water bottle, and my pain meds. And I was in charge of trying to keep on track of my pain meds, which didn't line up with feed times. And so yeah, I had to not only care for myself completely on my own, because I had to stay in there with no other help, unlike being in the maternity ward where I had midwives to help me, and then I had to care for my child right after I'd had a C-section. So that was actually quite a big challenge, but I'm grateful that I wasn't in as much pain as when I was with Hunter, because I would not have been able to do what I did with Oliver with Hunter, that's for sure. So I stayed there overnight and basically just persisted with keep trying to feed him. I eventually got the pediatrician to agree with me the next day that we would drop the top-up feeds down to 40 mil from 50 mil, because I kept saying that, well, obviously he's not hungry enough to feed from me, and eventually we did get him feeding throughout the day, but he wanted the feeds to be like 20 to 30 minutes long, and Oliver was only lasting anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes for a feed. And so eventually we did get in a lactation consultant who assessed me, could see that I had quite a good milk supply, because I was expressing every single feed and getting hundreds and hundreds of mils out every feed. I was pumping litres a day, and so that was nowhere near an issue. They'd already checked he didn't have tongue or lip ties. There was no physical reason that he could not feed with him, and I did remember thinking that he might have been getting sick, but the congestion is actually from the reflux, and obviously because he had been laying down for 24 hours, the reflux would have been pretty bad, because it would just constantly been coming up and down from him laying down and having all his muscles relaxed. So I basically persisted that whole day. I didn't leave the unit. I stayed there. I slept there overnight, didn't go home, nothing, didn't shower. I survived off whatever food was like brought to me by my husband and my mum, and just drank from my water bottle, and slept in quite a weird chair. It was like meant to be a sofa bed, but yeah, I don't know. I just basically sat in that, slept in that, fed in that, pumped in it, you know, that was basically it. And I was given these little containers to put my milk into once I had pumped each time, and that was put into a milk room. There was a fridge and a freezer depending on how old the milk was, and I had the most milk out of everyone there. I remember one of the midwives later on the second night actually took me in and showed me the room, because I had such a significant amount that one of them, I remember the freezer had something like 10 or more bottles of like 130 ml plus in them, and then you looked at some other people's milk, maybe only like 1 or 2 bottles in there. Hey. So they did show me that. I stayed there the second night, but because I didn't know how much longer he was going to be there, that night I did decide to go home for a shower. I literally had to time it between his feeds because he was 4-hourly feeds. So I got my husband to come and pick me up, drive me straight to the house. I literally had a shower, got changed, got back in the car and went straight back. And I felt a bit bad about that because like Hunter was, I think he was asleep or about to go to sleep. No, I think he was in bed. And yeah, so I had a shower, went back. That was that night before he was discharged. And then I stayed there overnight, and I got them to agree with me that if he had a feed for like what felt like a good feed, I didn't have to do a top up. I could just feed him and then let him go and see if he would demand feed or if he would not wake up for the 4 hours or something like that. And eventually he did start to wake every, I think, about 2.5 to 3 hours for his own feeds. And those 48 hours that we spent in there, I basically just dedicated to pumping the whole time. That was essentially all I did. And I edited the videos that you guys would have seen. So the night before Oliver was discharged, he was really unsettled. He was screaming after every single feed. He was very fussy. He was very irritated and very loud, and there were quite a lot of issues. He was so unsettled. He did not want to go back to sleep. And they ended up coming over and doing some checks on him and diagnosed him with silent reflux. And so that made for a bit of a difficult night, but we persevered and managed to get back to full feeding overnight. Okay. Alright, I'm back. I had to get a dummy. So on the night before Oliver was discharged, we had a lot of issues. He was very unsettled, and even though he was feeding really well overnight, he just did not want to be put down. He didn't want to sleep in his bed. He would scream after feeds. He would act like he was in a lot of pain and like he couldn't get any wind out. And this was very different to the very sleepy baby that had basically not woken up for 24 hours when he was in the maternity ward, because overnight he had every single feed via the breast. There was no top-ups overnight at all, and I was sitting up to feed him, and it was getting very draining. And my midwife who was helping, or the nurse who was helping with Oliver that night, could tell that he was very distressed, and so she came over and they got him assessed and diagnosed him with silent reflux, which basically means that after feeds, you're right? Basically means after feeds he cannot get rid of the gas, and all the acid reflux that he has gets stuck in his chest or his esophagus and doesn't come out like a colic baby would. So he does spew, but very rarely compared to how many feeds he has. He more so struggles to actually get it up. Okay, which is why he's so unsettled right now, because he's just had a feed. But, so they diagnosed that and gave me a couple of tips to try and help with it, but we are still trying to persevere with finding a way to solve that at the moment. Hey. So, anyway, the next morning, the discharge nurse came in and said that she was going to try and get us home that day because Oliver wasn't having any nasal tubes then, so there was no reason really for him to be in there. He had lost 10 grams of weight overnight, which wasn't a lot, and his bilirubin was perfectly fine because I had asked if he had had jaundice, just in case that was another reason why he'd been lazy with his feeds. Anyway, everything came back really good, so they went and said they would go and talk to the pediatric team and see if he could go home. Tom had only been there for maybe about 20 minutes, half an hour when this had happened. And then by the time they got back from the pediatric team, it was only about maybe another 10 minutes. And she said, okay, you can go home now. And it was just very like, I don't know, very fast, very out of the blue. I didn't expect him to go home that quickly. I expected to be there for a while before the pediatric team came. And so she goes, oh, you know, I need to get his nasal gastric tube out. So she came over and literally pulled that out in front of us, like really randomly. I didn't actually watch it come out because I think that would have been a little bit gross for me to watch. But she did that. She said she'd get some paperwork and then we could go. And so I had to call my mum up to tell her to come back to pick us up. And yeah, they decided that he was allowed to go home as long as he came back 2 days later for a review, which he did come back 2 days later, and he had gained 20 grams in those 2 days. And then he had a follow-up review at 2 weeks old with some other midwives or home care nurses, I guess, at our house, and he had gained another 250 grams in 5 days, so he'd gained 50 grams a day, so about 270 grams since he'd left the hospital, which they were more than happy with because he ended up above his actual birth weight by the time that they came and did his 2-week checkup, which in Australia generally they allow 2 weeks for them to get back to their birth weight because it is normal for babies to lose weight in the first few days when they lose things like fluid and meconium and all of that anyway. And obviously they're not getting a constant stream of food like they are with the placenta, so it takes a little bit of time for them to start gaining. But yeah, that's basically why he was in the special care unit. And when I left, I remember taking like so much milk home with me, liters and liters and liters of milk, and so much of it's still in my freezer now because the Nicu only keeps milk in the fridge for 48 hours instead of 4 days, and then they put it in the freezer. So I do actually have quite a lot in the freezer, and so I'm trying to use up all my fresh stuff by giving it to my other son Hunter in his bottles, which I'm going to do a whole nother video on tandem feeding and why and how I'm feeding breast milk to my other son. But this experience was definitely a lot less traumatic than Hunter's with Nicu. The only thing that was very traumatic was when they first put him in there and decided to tell me that I couldn't stay there in the chair next to him because that automatically triggered a lot of anxiety and separation anxiety for me. And so the midwives when I left did try and tell me that I was pretty amazing for sleeping in the chair next to him for the 2 nights. And over the days they did praise me a lot for how much I'd pumped, but I didn't really feel like sleeping in the chair was really that. I guess I felt it was a little bit sad that they thought it was so amazing that I would sleep in it, because even though it was nice for them to acknowledge that I had done it, like I said earlier, I don't know how many mums would voluntarily just leave their children there and go home. I didn't really feel like there was an option. I felt like that was just what was best for him and to get him feeding and out of there. And I remember when Hunter was also in the NICU that I would get my mum or my husband to go and sit with him sometimes, because I hated the idea of leaving them on their own. They've just spent 9 months on the inside with you 24/7, and then all of a sudden they're in this big bright world and they don't know anyone. And so yeah, I guess that to me just didn't really feel like there was a choice. It just felt like I just needed to be there to be mum, basically. And that's just how those days went. So we were only in there for, like I said, 2 nights, and It felt like a lot longer than that, but it definitely could have been worse. I'm so glad that they did bring in the lactation consultant in the end, because she was ultimately the person who ended up saying to the doctors that Oliver is a quick feeder. I have quite a fast letdown, and basically when my letdown comes out, it is enough to essentially drown him. So that's why I kind of have to pump before I feed him, so that he can actually have a chance at swallowing some without just swallowing air, trying to not drown in milk. And without her help, I'm sure that I would have been there for a lot longer, because there was a midwife in there who tried to up his feeds to 100 ml through the nasal gastric tube, which brought me to absolute tears, because I remember saying to her that if she did that, he would not wake up and he would not breastfeed. And I'm so glad that I did stick to my guns on that, because if she had have done that, I have no doubt that we would have been there for a lot longer. Usually at the end of these videos I'd say I hope you enjoyed this video, but I'm not sure that that really suits this video. But I hope this filled you guys in on what happened, and how Oliver's journey at the hospital kind of finished up. And I also hope that if any of you have babies on nasal gastric tubes, or if you have babies who aren't feeding well, that it kind of helps you have a little bit of motivation to keep persisting, because I've now had 2 babies who have not had the easiest breastfeeding journey at the beginning, and now I'm managing to breastfeed both my 17-month-old and my almost 3-week-old son. And even though we do have some challenges with the silent reflux, it's definitely a really good position to be able to keep feeding both of them with the vitamins. And I am going to do a video all about feeding both at the same time, because I think that there's a lot to learn from that, and a lot that I didn't know before I got pregnant with Oliver, or even now that I am feeding the 2 of them. So hopefully you guys subscribe. It's free. Click the red button down below and the bell next to it. I'm not too sure how often I'll post, but I will try and post a couple of times a week. So make sure you have that all turned on, so that you know notified whenever a new video goes live. And I hope to see you guys in the next video.